Welcome to a series that we call The End of Times, where we go through the book of Revelation verse by verse to try our best to understand what it is we can expect to happen in the end times, or the times Jesus referred to as the end of the age. And we've gone through the book of Revelation verse by verse. I highly recommend you go back and watch every episode, because you will get some out of this episode, but to truly understand, it's real important that you go through it verse by verse to really get a deeper meaning of where we are and how we got here. Where we left off was John had been taken up in the Spirit to the throne room of God. And we got a chance to kind of look around, and what we saw there were 24 elders, which I believe are humans, heavenly host of angels, millions and millions of angels, and 4 living creatures all surrounding the throne of God, all worshiping him. And then John notices that God has a scroll in his hand with 7 seals. And it's determined that only Jesus Christ is worthy to open those seals, because that particular prophecy was sealed up and set aside for the appointed time, and it is only Jesus Christ who can determine when the appointed time is. So he broke the first seal, and what we saw there was a horseman. Well, first a living creature said, "Come and see," and we saw a horseman who rode a white horse, and he was given a bow and a crown and went out to conquer. Now, what this is these horsemen are spiritual warriors for God, who are given authority to the rise and fall of kings and empires, and to wage war and peace on the earth. Now, we know that because Zechariah saw these same horsemen in Zechariah 1, and Zechariah lived during after the rise and fall of the greatest nation, or the greatest empire at the time, Babylon, and then he also witnessed the rise of Persia. And then he was released, as well as the Jews, to return to Israel and rebuild the temple. And as this is taking place, he sees these horsemen in the hollow among the myrtle trees, and they say to him, "We have walked to and fro throughout the earth, and behold, all the earth is resting quietly." So now we see these horsemen again in Revelation in the throne room of God. And as soon as that first seal breaks, that horseman knew exactly what his job was. He then went to anoint the kings of the earth that'll play a huge role in Revelation. I personally believe that those kings have already been anointed, and that seal is broken and already done, literally here on earth in this present time. And then we got to the second seal, and we'll pick it up in 3, and we've been talking about this for a couple episodes, but we're going to continue on. When he opened the second seal, I heard a second living creature saying, "Come and see." And another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. So this particular horseman, he was given a sword. Now, he's not killing people with his sword. He was given a sword to essentially break out war on the earth, that people might kill each other. So we've dedicated a couple episodes to prophetic wars and what that might look like. Last time, we talked about the Gog-Magog war, and this is a war with Russia and Iran invading Israel. Go take a look at that. But this time I wanted to take a moment and talk about a war that a lot of people have talked about. I often find that when people take the time to go through the book of Revelation, they really see things that a lot of people don't see. If we just kind of watch shows on it, or we read the Left Behind books, or we just grab verses, we truly don't understand what's taking place, and a lot of assumptions are made. Many people who don't really take the time to truly understand Revelation by cross-referencing it with the Bible and going that deep, talk of a scripture where God dries up the Euphrates River to make a way for the king of the earth, and people refer to this as some sort of prophetic war with China. So that's kind of what we're talking about today, is this prophetic war with China. Now, where do they even get this from, first of all? So We're going to jump ahead. We don't jump ahead typically unless we just kind of glance at something. What we're jumping ahead to is Revelation 16:12, and we will come back and we'll spend a lot of time in Revelation 16:12 when we get there. Right now, we're just talking about these wars. So this happens to be a war with China that a lot of people bring up. But I just want to kind of talk about what this is and possibly eliminate what people think this is. So they're talking about Revelation 16:12, where it says, "Then the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared." Now, oftentimes people just read that and they say, oh, well, that's clearly a prophetic war with China. That is not what that is. So let's kind of take a deeper look at this. Now, first of all, let's start by saying that this particular war in Revelation 16, again, it is not a war with China, and has a much, much deeper meaning than just here comes this, the river dried up and here comes this king from the east. That is not as simple as one might think. Now, certainly China is involved, and we will come back to this war in great detail, but it is not a specific war with China. But I do want to take a look at it and kind of shut that down quick. So let's take a look, first of all, at the river Euphrates. What is the relevance? Now, anytime we look at prophecy, we kind of go back to this idea that what we're talking about is prophecy of Israel and the coming of God's kingdom. So if it doesn't involve that, then it's probably not in here. So all these prophetic wars involve the coming of his kingdom, and they involve Israel. So what is the significance of the Euphrates River? Let's jump back to Genesis, all the way back to Genesis 15:8. Now, what's taking place in Genesis 15 is that God has essentially made a covenant with Abraham that his descendants will be the Israelites, and from him will come Jesus Christ, and that's why they are the chosen people, is because it is the lineage of Jesus Christ and has everything to do with the coming of God's kingdom. So God is talking to Abraham at this point, and in 15, now God has just made that covenant with Abraham. And then it goes on to say in 18, "On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." Now, what he's saying is God had given this land. Now, if you look at this map, Israel is just this tiny little nation, but the land that God had promised him went from Egypt to the Euphrates River. So anytime anybody's crossing that Euphrates, they're crossing into God's ordained territory for Israel, but not man's determined borders for Israel. So let's jump to, well, what does this mean to dry this river up? Because there's some deep meaning behind what takes place when God dries a river up. So we're going to go to Isaiah, and we're going to spend a little bit of time in Isaiah today, starting with 11:15. "The Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt with his mighty wind. He will shake his fist over the river and strike it in the seven streams and make men cross over dry shod." Now, God ordained that from the river Euphrates to the great river in Egypt, and that could be the Nile, but that Nile's not dried up. Now, there's probably some sort of significant river that literally separated Egypt from Israel at the Red Sea, most likely. And it had dried up. God had dried it up. Now, what he means is he had essentially removed a major border of protection, and that's very significant. He essentially opened up this protective border of the river. God is in the business of drying up rivers for defenses. So let's jump to Isaiah 19, 4-7. "And the Egyptians I will give into the hand of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them, says the Lord of hosts. The waters will fail from the sea, and the river will be wasted and dried up. The river will turn foul, and the brooks of defense will be emptied and dried up. The reeds and rushes will wither, the papyrus reeds by the river, by the mouth of the river, and everything sown by the river will wither, be driven away, and be no more." So, again, this is an example of when God essentially destroyed the southern border of Israel, which has already taken place. But that's kind of why he did that. It was to take down defensive rivers. So let's keep going. Let's kind of keep talking about this, because when we looked at the Gog-Magog war, God said he was going to put hooks in the Prince of Russia and pull him into battle, making a way for the battle of ultimately what we're looking at when it comes to what we looked at in Revelation 16 is the Battle of Armageddon. Now, what Armageddon even means, and again, we're going to come back to that when we get there. We're not going to get that deep into it right now. But essentially, all the kings of the beast, the 10 kingdoms, which certainly has China involved, will meet in the hill country of Megiddo, and in Hebrew, that's Har Megiddo or Armageddon. And that's ultimately what this is that we're looking at here. And again, we'll spend a lot of time on that, but what is it about this river and why is it God is doing this? So let's take another look. Let's stay in Isaiah for a while, because Isaiah has a lot to say about these kings of the east and the drying up of the river. So we're going to talk about Isaiah 46 real quick, or we're going to jump to 46, verse 11, where he says, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man who executes my counsel. From a far country, indeed, I have spoken it. I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it. I will also do it. Now, God is talking about here, he's calling a bird of prey from the east. This is very significant because now we're kind of pointing at this idea that, yes, kings from the east are being pulled, much like Magog is being pulled into battle, and that's really what these horsemen do, at least the red horsemen. Now, again, we will come back to what these 10 kings are. I mean, they ultimately make up the beast, and they all then meet at this hill of Megiddo. We'll spend a lot of time on that, but I just want to eliminate that this is not a war with China. Yeah, certainly China's involved, but it is not a specific war with China. So when people talk about this prophetic war with China, where the Euphrates River dries up and then China comes in from the east, that is not what this is, and is definitely taken out of context big time. So I just want to close out with kind of another thought of what this drying up of the Euphrates to make way for the kings of the east might mean. And it's, oftentimes there's dual prophetic meanings in many things that God does. So let's take a look at Isaiah 41:2 real quick. So we're kind of eliminate, this is not a war with China only. But what is this making a way for the kings of the east? Is there deeper meaning to this? If we look at Isaiah 41:2, it says, who raised up one from the east, who in righteousness called him to his feet? Now we're talking about Jesus here. Who gave the nations before him and made him rule over kings, who gave them as the dust to his sword, as driven stubble to his bow. So God raised up one from the east. Jesus comes from the east. There is some belief that really this is making the way for the coming of Jesus Christ, because if you read of the Euphrates River dries up, and it could just be a deeper meaning. It's not a war with China, but it is a war of bringing people from the east, the north, the south, and the west, with the only border to the north and the east being the Euphrates River. But there's prophecy after prophecy about Jesus Christ coming and his return from the east, and that's pretty significant as well, because as soon as the battle of Har Megiddo is over, it's ultimately God destroying them and destroying Babylon, and then the coming of Jesus Christ. So just kind of a side note that could be a deeper meaning of making a way for the King of the East. And then I want to take one last look at Isaiah 48 and 49, because there is mention of the coming of Jesus Christ and making a way for China. So Isaiah 48 goes through essentially the bringing back of Israel, and then 49 gets into the redemption of Jesus Christ to the world. And 49, 6 through 7 says, indeed, he says, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also give you as a light to the Gentiles, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth. So ultimately, God is saying, I'm restoring Israel, which he did in 1948, and now I'm redeeming all of the earth through Jesus Christ, which again he did 2,000 years ago. And if you go on, if you jump to 11 and 12, it says, I will make each of my mountains a road, and my highways shall be elevated. Surely these shall come from afar. Look, those from the north and the west, and these from the land of Sinim. Now, Sinim is the land of China. So absolutely, they play a role in this. There is no doubt in my mind that they play a role in this final war. But again, we're going to get way in. We'll probably spend a couple days on Armageddon and what that looks like when we get to it. I just want to take this time to really talk about why is it God dried up the river Euphrates, and kind of eliminate that there's this thing where the river dries up and here comes China. That's not what takes place. It's a much, much deeper meaning, and it's a much more complicated war than that. So I just wanted to eliminate the prophetic war with China. Yes, China is very involved, but no, it's not just a single war with China. It's a very different, very, very significant war that will take place. So I want to take the next episode and talk about the timeline. So we're kind of rolling. There's so many wars that are taking place. We can spend a ton of time talking about these wars, and I want to take this time to talk about the timeline, because we're going to get into Daniel on Saturday, who in Daniel 11 talks about these wars of the Antichrist and these wars of tribulation, and then it gets into a very specific timeline. And I want to take next week to talk about that timeline. It's really a tough thing to try to figure out, well, when do you talk about the timeline? I think this is the appropriate time. So we'll hit that on Saturday. So stay with us. Again, I just wanted to kind of eliminate this concept of this war with China that a lot of people talk about. It's very much, if you Google China, war with China in the Bible, what you're going to find is just thousands and thousands and thousands of people really bringing up this one tiny verse and saying that this is a war with China. It is not. Yes, China is involved, but no, it is not a war with specifically China. So thank you. Stay with us. There's a lot of wars still to be had. So we are going to talk about the timeline next. And I'd love to hear your comments on this. Definitely put them below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support our channel through Patreon, that link is also below. But the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests, so never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.